Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Greg. I'm delighted to be here and talk to y'all today. And it's going to be tough for me to get this all in, but I'm going to do my best. So if the 20% of Rotarians or children, your grandchildren, aren't impressed by, say, Schwab or Goldberg or Jay Leno, what about Keira Knightley or Albert Einstein? Like, everybody wants to have some genetic trait with one of those, right? And so, obviously, if you know me, and my gig is dyslexia, you know that it's about dyslexia. And 20% of the population, in fact, has dyslexia. I would say that you look at these individuals who are obviously successful. They were also in school before we had Common Core and before we had standardized tests. And the reason that's important, dyslexics are average to above average IQ. They're big picture thinkers. They're very creative. They're good at critical thinking. If you give them a test of 100 multiple choice questions on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, they are going to fail. Or they're going to really have to work for months to pass. And so what I'd like to do today is help you see, and hopefully this is time well spent, but help you see the differences that occur for a dyslexic's life if they're identified early and given what they need versus those that are not identified. So, dyslexia, we have a definition in state law that mirrors federal law. This isn't, oh my, what happened? It's not the whole definition. Can we get to the next slide? Let's try it. There we go. It's an unexpected difficulty in reading for an individual who has the intelligence to be a much better reader. And we're going to go over that, and we're, again, going to look at these two different paths. But what I want you to hear from next is the Dr. Shaywitzes who work at the Yale Medical School. And I've worked with them for about 15 years. They're both in the National Academy of Science, and their body of work is really the body of the work in the medical and the scientific literature. And so let's hear what they have to say.
Yale University doctors Sally and Bennett Shaywitz have been married for some 5 decades. In 1983, they began tracking the reading of more than 400 kindergartners, picked at random. They're still tracking them today.
What we found was that 1 in 5 were dyslexic.
1 in 5?
1 in 5.
I would have thought maybe 1 in 20.
Well, that's what the dogma was, but now it's clear that it is very common.
But perhaps their most important finding, there is no link at all between dyslexia and intelligence.
The biggest misunderstanding is that people who read slowly aren't smart.
IQ is on the top and reading is on the bottom.
The Shaywitzes compared typical readers whose reading skills mirror their IQs with dyslexic readers whose reading skills don't.
It's not just that it's low, it's that the gap gets wider as
Right,
the years go on.
and they don't connect. One doesn't influence the other.
So, a little bit more about what dyslexia is. It is matching the sound of spoken language to print. And that's what's causing that difficulty in learning to read. And so, dyslexics read from the right anterior part of the brain, which is what we call an inefficient system. Non-dyslexics read from the left posterior system. The rest of the brain looks normal, but it just happens that they are born with this difference in brain anatomy. And so for them, getting to that sound symbol correlation is difficult. And you think about it, if you look back at civilization for hundreds of thousands of years, the way that we transmitted information from generation to generation was orally. We told stories. So the brain was hardwired from the beginning to speak. Reading is a fairly new feature of the brain. It's evolved, but we have to teach children how to read. The majority of kids speak spontaneously, but reading is what is so important and what is taught, especially in the first and second grade. So you're taking lines and circles and making them have meaning, and that is what's called phonology, or this phonological processing. That's the problem that dyslexics have. And so as Bloomfield said, it's a way of recording language to this visible, to these visible marks. And so what I want to show you next is another video from the same CBS Sunday morning show. And this is of a dyslexic, and this will, again, I'm trying to contrast those that get what they need with those that don't get identified in what they need.
As an only child, Kathy Drennan gravitated toward grown-ups, especially smart ones.
I was kind of an intellectual geeky kid. I go to a dinner party and there was a kids table and an adults table, and I was like, I'd rather sit at the adults table because the conversation will be more interesting.
You were a nerdy
I
little kid.
was a nerdy little kid.
Come first grade, the nerdy kid landed in the highest reading group at school, only to realize she could not learn to read.
And they were like, okay, let's drop her down a little bit. Nope. How about down a little farther? And I don't know how many reading groups there are, but I was in the bottom.
Determined that her smart child not fail, Drennan's mother did research, found a specialist, and got the diagnosis: severe dyslexia.
For someone who is not dyslexic, is it like if I were to look at Arabic?
That's sort of how I felt. Like I just couldn't make any sense.
She ended up teaching herself to read in the 6th grade, but not the way most of us do.
I recognize the shape of words, and I see the shape, and I say, oh, that's that word, and then I memorize what that word sounds like. So where did this equation come from?
She seems to have gotten good at it. Drennan is now a tenured professor of chemistry and biology at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
The way that I learned to view the world, from learning to read, memorizing these shapes, and looking at shapes and thinking of what is that shape, what is this language, what is this code, definitely makes me a better scientist. I would come along and look at this and go, I recognize that shape.
Though encouraging, isolated success stories like Drennan's also remind Dr. Cassidy of the challenges ahead.
How are we as society doing in terms of dealing with this problem?
Here, we should be screening for dyslexia at the end of kindergarten. So I'm sort of like a repeating record, and not to be Debbie Downer, because I'm going to tell you some positive things, but obviously Kathy Drennan is an exception. And again, if you go back to the slide which Dr. Bennett-Shaywitz was talking about, you see with the dyslexic, the IQ does not influence reading. So Kathy Drennan obviously has a very high IQ, but she was put in the lowest reading group. And you know that would baffle most parents and most teachers. And so you can imagine if others, that same thing occurs of what they may be told, thinking they're like a non-dyslexic and their IQ and their reading are influenced by each other or linked. So it's really important that people understand this. So we'll talk a little bit about school-age clues. Dyslexia does not go away. We talked about it manifests usually as a difficulty in learning to read. A lot of dyslexics will have speech delay. Not all of them, but it's something that's commonly seen. And then when you get to 3 or 4 years of age, they have difficulty learning the alphabet. So they may learn their ABCs, A, B, C, D, E, F, G in the morning, but they forget it in the afternoon. And it's not just reciting the alphabet, it's matching the alphabet to the sound, knowing that A is A in cake and A in cape, but it's also A in cat and A in bat, and that B is B, and so on. So again, we're trying to raise awareness because we can't identify till the end of kindergarten, but clearly there are things we can look for when they're young. They are slow readers, as Dr. Sally Shaywitz talked about, and that's because they're reading from this inefficient system on the right side. And that's why the accommodation of extra time is so important. Spelling, adult dyslexics are terrible spellers. The hallmark of an adult dyslexic usually is a slow reader and terrible spelling. Thankfully, we've got spell check. But I will say a lot of dyslexics tell me my spelling isn't even good enough for spell check. Foreign language, that's difficult, right? Because that's a whole new system. That's a whole new spoken language to print. And that's, sometimes people are struggling along, but then when they get to high school foreign language, then it's really like, this is a problem. The other thing, if it's a kid is called on in class in the younger ages, and the teacher says, stand up and read, this is a humiliating experience for a child with dyslexia. So that's why it's so important that we help identify so they're not mocked, made fun of, they're not lazy, they're not stupid, they have a real entity. So again, self-esteem is an issue because you can imagine if you're a bright kid and you compare yourself with other kids in the class, especially in those younger years, you know they're learning to read and you're not. So I do want to say a little bit about the goals of our early screening. So screening, the best way for me to explain it to you is you think about mammography and colonoscopy. So if you have a mammogram and you have calcifications, they call you back for more tests. It means you're at risk for cancer, but you don't necessarily have cancer. Or you do a colonoscopy and they see a polyp, they have you come back. The same is for dyslexia because it's common, and if not identified, the ramifications can be pretty severe. So the recommendation is for universal screening of dyslexia at the end of kindergarten. That is the earliest that we can validly identify dyslexics. The other thing that's important is that if you look at kids' acquisition of reading skills, first and second grade, the slope looks like this. These non-dyslexics, they are learning how to read. Because what happens, that slope will flatten out because you're really acquiring what you can, what you're going to be as a proficient reader, especially in first and second grade, but in first through fifth grade. That's when it's going to carry through with you the rest of your life. So if we don't identify them, they're getting further and further behind. You cannot catch up. So again, we're trying to prevent that loss of self-esteem and identify them so they can get the services they need. Sea of Strengths, this is small print, it's hard to see, but I think it's really important that we help these kids, because school is a struggle, especially if you have moderate to severe dyslexia, that we get them what they need, that we give them avenues to show their strengths through critical thinking, through project-based learning, through reasoning. And the next, I want to show you a video of an unfortunate person who was not identified at an early age and what could happen if you don't have a mom who's pushing the school system or whomever to get you your services.
We're told reading is fundamental. So what happens to the millions of children struggling with words? For our cover story, Susan Spencer looks into the mysteries of dyslexia.
There's diminished high school graduation, diminished entry into college and college graduation, and we know that there's the number of people with dyslexia that are incarcerated.
A fact that led Dr. Cassidy to this Louisiana maximum security prison. And that led, just recently, to an astonishing finding.
Of the prisoners that we screened and tested, we found that over 50% had dyslexia.
Over 50%, so more than half.
More than half.
21-year-old Jonathan Wilson is one of the inmates in Dr. Cassidy's study. He has dyslexia, but until now, no one knew it.
What was it like when you were first learning to read, when you were a little kid?
It was real slow. It was real hard for me to understand the words.
Wilson, a first-time offender, is serving a 12-year sentence.
Did you finish high school?
No,
And what happened?
I got charged with armed robbery.
You got charged with armed robbery. You got convicted of armed robbery.
Yes.
So here we are.
So here we are.
What do you say to people who might say, why should I care about dyslexia in prisons?
It's a life. Why wouldn't we want to help the life? And then if we want to reduce recidivism, you can do that if you identify them as dyslexic and give them the tools that they need.
So it turns out I was the one that tested Jonathan. He reads on the level of a first grader. His IQ test, he completed the nonverbal, that with the patterns to the very end. And when I told him, I'm like, you're very smart, Jonathan, but you have dyslexia. And of course, he'd never heard that. And he wants to be a clothes designer, which makes perfect sense because he saw the patterns in the IQ test and got all the way to the end, which, is unusual. And I asked him, and what he told me was, he said, I knew if I ever learned to read, I would really be successful. So I say that because obviously there are a large number of people like Jonathan that we want to help before they end up incarcerated. So again, the failure to screen and test, the costs are very high. I don't have enough time to go into all of it, but we recommend screening. It tells you if you're at risk for dyslexia or if you're not. If you're at risk, if you have a good screener, the vast majority of those kids will be dyslexic. Those that aren't, then you find out why they're having difficulty to read. And we do that so that we can prevent these costs like incarceration, failure to go to complete high school or go to college. Bringing it down to Louisiana, this is our NAEP. This was from 2022. And if you look at the top, you can see that we had about 56% of the fourth graders. NAEP is called the nation's report card. It's done for 4th and 8th grade. It's random who they pick. So this is really valid data. In 2022, our percent of reading below basic is at 43%. That's basically 43% of the population is illiterate in 4th grade, which they're at the window, finishing that window. They've passed the 1st and 2nd grade to acquire the skills, and they're almost through that 5th grade window. If you look at the nation's average, you can see that it's a little bit lower. If you look at the miracle of Mississippi, they're at 37%. So we know from data and from other studies that a large percentage of these kids are in fact dyslexic. And then we had legislation that was passed here, and when we look at 2nd and 3rd graders, we have 50% in both grades that are not reading on grade level. So when this came out in the Journal of Pediatrics, I was like, oh yeah, this is it. Everybody's gonna see this and policy's gonna be changed, and that was over 5 years ago. But what it shows is the achievement gap for dyslexics versus non-dyslexics is present in the 1st grade. And if you think about those acquisition skills that dyslexics don't have, learning the alphabet, rhyming, all of those are pre-K skills and kindergarten skills, then it makes sense that they would come into 1st grade behind. And if the gap is addressed in the 1st grade, we can narrow it. We can't get rid of it completely. And if not, it just continues to widen. This is me bragging a little bit on the state. We had several legislators that offered this legislation. And if you look from left to right, Act 411, it basically allows teachers to go through a 1 or 2 year training after they go through 4 years of college. It's great. They become language therapists or practitioners. They can get paid more money. It can go on their teaching certificate, and they can teach dyslexic students in a way they need to be taught. Act 208, that was the definition was passed that we looked at. In Act 419, we passed a law in Louisiana that requires schools to report the prevalence of dyslexia in the schools, in every school. And unfortunately, it's still less than 1% in every parish, in every school, but data drives policy, and so I'm still encouraged that this is going to change things. Act 617, basically what that does is that the dyslexics, the students in college were not being taught about dyslexic. They might have like 30 minutes. This mandates in their 12 hours block of reading instruction, 3 hours of that is for the instruction of teaching a dyslexic how to read. And the Board of Regents was great, and so I'm very encouraged about that. And then 266 and 517, basically that mandates that we have screening at the end of kindergarten with a great screener. And if the parent should get a letter, and if they get the letter, they can have their kid tested, and that will be paid by the state. And so, again, I'm really proud of Louisiana and encouraged for the future. October is Dyslexia Awareness Month. We're looking for people to talk about dyslexia. It's common, it's 20%, has nothing to do with IQ. If you're interested in learning more, there's a Coursera course on dyslexia. It's free. If you don't want the certificate, it's like $75 if you do. Encourage your teacher friends to become a CALT or a CALP and use the word dyslexia so that we can get rid of that shame. So it was quick, but I thank you, and I hope the information helps you understand what's going on.
Dr. Cassidy, we want to thank you for this presentation. I'm the mom of 2 dyslexic individuals, one of which was told that she would never graduate from Patricia High School. She was accepted to Columbia School of Art this summer, and she's an art prodigy. So thank you for this information.
Laura, bear with me for a second. I have 7 brothers and sisters, so we had a microcosm of education in our household. And 2 of my sisters we all went to the same school, but 2 of my sisters did not have phonics in their curriculum. They both ended up as terrible spellers and terrible readers. Is phonics required in our public school system? First question. And secondly, answer that one first.
So it turns out that some of the schools were using what's called cueing, which means you just look at the picture and you don't learn phonics. That the legislature passed a law that you can't use cueing, and so I can't guarantee every school is using phonics, but there was a decades-long debate over whether phonics was good or not, and I think we're swinging back, thankfully, to phonics.
The second question is, I understand that using closed captioning on your TV to have your kids reading as they're watching TV is very helpful. Is that true?
So if you're dyslexic, the technology is huge. And if you've missed the window to learn how to read between 1st and 5th grade, you can still succeed because we got AI and all this great technology. But reading and hearing it, so you're absolutely going to improve your vocabulary, which improves your reading. So I'm all for listening to and reading the captions while something is being said.
You talked about the problem in the prisons and how many inmates can't read, are dyslexic. what resources are available for those who have dyslexia being released from prison to get help so that they can become productive in society?
Yeah, we tried working with the prisons here. It's really tough because of the firewalls in the prison. I know that there are people interested, and I can't give you specifics, but obviously these are bright people. If we could remediate them, help them understand they're dyslexic, because just knowing you're not stupid really helps you tackle life. And then again, almost everybody has a cell phone, which does more and more with AI, with text-to-speech. So I'd love to say that it was a seamless transfer to prison to the workforce, but it is not. Last question.
One more, talking to you before, I told you that I had a grandson who's my son-in-law's stepson, who's now 26 years old, but he was diagnosed. And if you would give him a test in the early days before he was really trained, you could give him a test in a class that take 30 minutes and he'd get an F. I mean, if he got 50%, he was lucky. Give him that same test and give him 2 hours to complete it, to figure out the questions, then he could make 100 on it. So he knew the content, he just couldn't figure out what they were asking him for. Can you explain that?
Well, that's that inefficient system, and that's why that accommodations of extra time is so important. It's not giving them a leg up, it's putting them on an equal playing field. I think I have to say goodbye, but thank y'all.